Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Curator's Tour by Danielle Siemens of Making Art, Building Community, 100 Years of the Edmonton Art Club. My name is Michael Mangson. I am the Public Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We are currently in the AGA building, which is in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, the traditional land of a diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and who continue to call this place home today. We are very excited to be looking at the exhibition, Making Art, Building Community, here at the AGA that celebrates 100 years of the Edmonton Art Club. Thank you so much for joining us. This tour is made possible in part through the support from the Heart and Soul Fund by EPCOR. I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support as well. This is a hybrid program with people tuning in virtually. Hello to the people on Zoom and also in person. If you're attending virtually and would like to ask a question for the Q&A portion at the end of the tour, please use the Q&A function on Zoom or the chat function on Facebook to ask your questions. Without further delay, I'm going to introduce Danielle. Danielle Siemens is the collection manager and curatorial associate at the AGA. She attained her MA in art history from Carleton University and has worked at the National Gallery of Canada and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. Danielle has worked in the AGA since 2017 in various curatorial roles. She currently manages the AGA's collection of over 6,000 objects, overseeing all new acquisitions and the administrative work for artworks that go on exhibition at the AGA or on loan to other galleries. So impressive. Well, I'll let you take it away, Danielle.
Thank you. Oh, don't need to clap. So thanks, Michael, for the introduction. I'll probably minutes and then we'll do a Q&A, but feel free to ask me questions as we go along if there's something you want to know more about or something you want to see that I've kind of skipped over. As Michael mentioned, I'm also the collections manager here. So this exhibition, I think about half of it is from our collection, and then the rest is from other public and private collections, mostly in Edmonton. And, you know, I think this exhibition was almost 2 years in the making from my part. I know the Edmonton Art Club has been thinking about this anniversary for a long time. And so it took a lot of research, and obviously we're talking about 100 years. So I'm going to try to touch on some highlights. But as I said, if there's anything you really want to know more about, please feel free to ask me as we go along. I recognize a few of you, so I know that you will know about the Edmonton Art Club. But first, I just kind of wanted to gauge people's knowledge of the club here. So is anyone here familiar with the Edmonton Art Club? Is there anything you know about them? Something you might be able to tell us? Betty, you can go ahead if you'd like.
But there was always a story of and so part of what we did to get ready was turn those files all over to Danielle, and we also went through them to gather information for a book that we published commemorating 100 years, and it was just a real pleasure. So yeah, the Edmonton Art Club is alive and well. If anybody wants to look at joining, just go online, just Google Edmonton Art Club, and you'll get to our website. And send me an email if you want to, or just chat to the contact there. Yeah, be a pleasure to respond to any interest. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks, Betty. So Betty is a member of the club, and what she didn't say is that the Edmonton Art Club is the longest running arts organization in Alberta. So they were founded in 1921, and they've been really instrumental to shaping the arts, not only in the city, but in the whole province. So this exhibition celebrates their 100th anniversary, which with about 75 artworks from, I think, 56 artists. So over that 100-year history, they've had nearly 500 members. So I could only showcase a pretty small amount, but it kind of gives you a nice overview. We have artwork spanning from about 1918 to the early 2000s, and various subject matter, style, and media. I also want to note off the top that we have an exhibition of their current members downstairs in the Ledcor Theatre Community Gallery. So if there's time at the end of this evening, you can check out their current members' work downstairs, or return before the show ends on January 23rd. And that space is actually free, so you don't need to pay admission for the rest of the gallery to see that exhibition. So I just want to start by stressing that phrase, building community. And one thing I really tried to showcase in this exhibition is that the story of the Edmonton Art Club is not about the club alone, but about how they have contributed to sort of the arts climate or ecology in the city and province. So they were instrumental to actually founding or to starting this very gallery in 1924, as well as the Alberta Society of Artists. Their members, in addition to being artists, were also art critics for the journal. They were art teachers in the public school district, but also post-secondary. They were important to establishing the fine art program at the U of A, to the Banff School of Fine Arts, which we now know as the Banff Center. And they worked as gallery owners and gallery administrators. And so really kind of building this community. So let's walk a little bit into the space, and I'll kind of stand in front of this wall here. And don't be afraid of the camera. Helen can kind of move around us, so gather close if you need to hear me. So I just want to start with a little bit more background. The Edmonton Art Club was not the first art association in Edmonton. They were actually preceded by something called the Edmonton Art Association in 1914. Now, just to set the stage a little bit, I want us to think about what Edmonton would have looked like at the time. So the city was established in 1904 as a city. In 1912, they amalgamated with Strathcona across the river, and the population at this point was really booming. So I think about 72,000 prior to the war, and that decreased significantly with World War I. But even after the war, few streets were paved, electricity and phone service was fairly sporadic still. Natural gas only became really available in the early 20s. So just thinking about that setting, it doesn't seem maybe like the arts would be kind of top priority. But for a select community, they really strove to build up the arts in this city, which is evidenced by the Art Association, which formed in 1914, as well as other earlier groups like the Amateur Dramatic Club in 1896, and the Women's Musical Club, which formed in 1910. So we have the formation of all these clubs happening. And the Edmonton Art Association, their goal was really to combat this prevalent wartime attitude that art was an expendable frill. And so they operated really under the auspices of the Edmonton Public School Board, and they put on lectures and classes on art and art history, and they put on some of the very first exhibitions in Edmonton. So those included artwork by students, but also loans from the National Gallery and from the US. So they were bringing art from the biggest gallery in the country into Western Canada, which was just sort of growing its art scene. So then some of those members from the association went on to form the Edmonton Art Club, and they wanted to continue that mission of stressing the importance of art in everyday life. They held their very first meeting on October 6th, 1921, so just about 2 months prior to today, in the studio of William Johnston. And this is William Johnston, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. He is often talked about as the very first professional artist in this city. And he had a studio in the Tegler building. So some of you might remember the Tegler building on 101st. It then became the BMO building, and now it's demolished. It's an empty spot. But that's where they had their first meeting. So they started with 14 charter members that were selected by a local jury. And the original constitution outlined 3 main aims. So one of those was a critical evaluation of each other's work. So coming together to look at work, critique it, to improve your practice. The next was exhibiting, so putting work on display for people to see in the city. And last was sales, so actually selling, making money from your work and labor. And those 3 things the club continues to do today. So it's really shaped their kind of mandate for the 100 years. So this wall here is about their charter members. And I have set work by 7 of their 14 originals. So first is William Johnston. He was born in Scotland and he was trained there as an artist. So sometimes you'll see, or quite a few of the other artists in the beginning are what we might call amateur. So in that sense, they often didn't have a formal art education and maybe didn't work as an artist as their full-time career. But we have to remember about Edmonton at the time, there weren't really opportunities for a formal art education. We didn't have the BFA program at the U of A yet or anything like that. But he was an exception. He was trained in England. And he came to Edmonton in 1912, and as I mentioned, established a really successful studio in the Tegler building. He also taught, so he taught at the Edmonton Technical School, which would be kind of an early version of what is NAIT today, as well as in Wetaskiwin High School. And many of the charter members were some of his students. So he was a really important educator in the city. And one thing I do want to stress as well is that his wife was very important to the club. So she wasn't an artist or a member, but she was sort of nicknamed the club's mother, and she was really important to their administrative functions. And I just wanted to touch upon that because I think there were a lot of women, especially in the history of museums and in Western Canada, that were contributing to the arts as volunteers and fundraisers and don't always get sort of the spotlight or the credit. So Johnston drew his inspiration from lakes and mountains in Alberta. He was a really avid mountain climber. And does anyone recognize this scene? It might not be completely obvious.
Is it Lake Louise?
It's not Lake Louise. But it is in the Rockies. It's Mount Robson and Lake Kinney. And what's great is that he wrote a lot of diaries. So we believe this painting was likely made on a trip he took to Mount Robson camping and hiking in 1918 with Harry Bullia. That is the artist who made those portraits there. So they would have traveled together and made sketches, and then he likely made this painting. And he's really kind of influenced by a British watercolor tradition. So he's using these kind of delicate colors, creating this kind of hazy light on the mountains, sort of just capture this peaceful summer day in the Rockies. I'm going to talk now about this painting here. So there were 3 of the 14 charter members that were women. And that's a key part of this history. Women have been important to the club since its earliest days. They were members and artists. They were also presidents, part of the executive, and important teachers in the city. So I was only able to include 1, but we have the work of Bérangère Mercier. So she was born in Quebec and came to Alberta around 1909. And she was primarily self-taught, but she actually also studied with Johnston. And she had a degree in music, actually, and was important to establishing the Edmonton Civic Opera Society. And the reason I bring that up is because many of these artists were also involved in other cultural endeavors. So taking part in music or drama. And professionally, she actually worked for the Postal Service. But this work is quite different than the Johnstone, even though she trained with him. So it's of the hoodoos, but it's this really kind of icy, wintry feel. It's a little odd. I feel like I haven't been able to completely pin down this painting. And it's almost getting into a little bit of abstraction of the scene, kind of paring down the elements and the shapes. Yeah. And then we'll look at one final work on this wall. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. This is J. Gordon Sinclair. Again, he was a really important educator. So he taught for over 25 years with the Edmonton Technical School. And he was one of the people who started the Edmonton Art Association and then went on to become a charter member of the club. But he was born in Ontario and trained in Toronto. And so he came to Edmonton, I believe, probably 1911 or 12. And so that would have been before the Group of Seven's time, but he was kind of in that community of some of those artists that would go on to form the Group of Seven and their associates. So we can see some influence in that kind of beginnings of sort of modern art trends in Canada. And he really wasn't interested. He mostly did landscapes, but this is a nice kind of industrial scene, a kind of counterparts to some of these landscapes we're seeing here. And he really wasn't interested in like a high realistic kind of painting. He wanted looser sort of paint application and brush strokes. So we can see, it is fairly detailed, but you don't have the really fine kind of details we have in some of those earlier paintings. And yeah, this nice sort of industrial scene, you get the sense of what things would have been happening at that time. Okay, we're gonna go to these cases.
Is that a?
You know what, I'm actually not quite sure. Do you think it is?
I know.
It's untitled, so I'm not sure.
I've seen one of his works just with a brown, like beige and brown, just like a, almost like a road. Would that be good?
Maybe, possibly. Mhm.
Very edges or shapes.
Yeah, it has very geometric. So I apologize if not everyone can see this, but as we walk through, you can kind of take a look. So as Betty mentioned at the beginning, I, in putting together this exhibition, had access to the Edmonton Art Club's archives, which was pretty amazing. And so I've included a sampling of their catalogs from their art exhibitions, starting with their very first one in 1922. So shortly after they formed in the fall of 1921, they put on their first art exhibition around Easter time. And that became an annual tradition that continues to this day. Exhibitions throughout the year as well. And often these were in really formal spaces, like at the Edmonton Art Gallery for many years, but sometimes in spaces like hospitals or shopping malls as well. What I like about this display, though, is that it really shows you sort of the progression of graphic design over the years. So we have this early 20s, it's a bit more like Art Deco, and then you can tell in the 2000s, they're obviously using digital technologies and computers. But exhibiting, as I mentioned, has been a really important part of their mandate in that last 100 years. Then I've also included 2 exhibition brochures from the Edmonton Museum of Arts, which is now the Arts Gallery of Alberta. So one of these is the very first exhibition we had, and that was in 1925. And before we had a permanent space, this show was in one of the rooms at the Hotel Macdonald. And you'll notice, sure, is that there was a whole section showcasing Edmonton Art Club artists. And why this is so important is that the Edmonton Art Club and the AGA have had a very close working relationship for a long time. So not only exhibit here, but some of them were directors of the gallery. Several of them taught in our education program, were volunteer capacities or on the board of directors. They also helped to build our collection. So they donated works of art to our collection or donated acquisition funds. An example of which is on the wall behind us. So this work is from 1925 and it's by Alvin Cartmell. And this was the second work to be donated to the AGA, and it was from the Edmonton Art Club. So this really kind of inaugurates our collecting program, which, as Michael mentioned, is now over 6,000 works of art. Cartmell was also from England and came to Canada in 1923. And he really fell in love with the vastness of the country, but he was particularly enamored with winter. So winter scenes were his specialty. And a lot of these winter scenes actually ended up being given to royalty or to diplomats. One went to a political figure from Pakistan. So we see kind of like the Johnston, but not in watercolor, this very atmospheric scene, a limited color palette, really capturing that kind of cold, biting air in like a summer prairie day. But one kind of treat being able to access the archive is that there were all these handwritten biographies and lots of quotes from people who knew the artists at the time. So I'm going to read you one that I liked about Cartmell because it really kind of captures his dedication to painting in the winter. So, painted winter landscapes as no one else could. Hoar frost was one of his specialties. One afternoon in 20 temperatures, I found him standing in a snowdrift near Florence Mortimer's studio on 5th Street. And Florence Mortimer was another art club artist. He was doing charcoal sketches of the Anglican cathedral with its burden of snow and hanging icicles. There was an artist who loved his work and was determined to get it right. It just kind of gives you that image of him painting outside in these really cold temperatures. And then Florence Mortimer, who was just mentioned, is whose work we're going to look at next. So as you'll notice, we've seen a lot of landscapes. This wall kind of begins one of the thematic sections of this exhibition, which is about landscapes and the natural world. And as we move through, you'll see how artists have applied different styles to the landscapes. We move from a kind of more impressionist influenced landscape to pretty much full abstraction by sort of when we round the corner, which we'll see in a moment. This is Florence Mortimer. She was one of the earliest art educators in this city and was really important to teaching a lot of the artists in this show, actually. She was born in South Africa and trained in England, and then she moved with her family to Northern Alberta. But eventually they came to Edmonton and settled here. And her husband was really ill. So she returned to teaching art to support her entire family. And she had an art educator career in Edmonton for over 30 years and taught, as I said, many of the people in this show and elsewhere in the city. Another thing about Mortimer and several of the artists in this show is that they were part of lots of clubs, other local, regional, and national groups. So she was a part of the Alberta Society of Artists, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Another club, which I haven't been able to find too much information about, but they have this great title. They were called the Women Sketch Hunters of Alberta. And then also the Federation of Canadian Artists, so a national group that had local chapters. Does anyone recognize this vantage point? So now we're looking at a scene of Edmonton.
It's like from Highlands Golf Course.
Right on. That's exactly it. Yeah. And it's a pretty similar view today. So yeah, this is a view from Highlands. But this painting is quite a bit later. It's around 1940 than the earlier ones we looked at. So we can see how Mortimer is, using a little bit more expressive color, some kind of looser brush stroke. She's not using a ton of detail to depict the scene, but is capturing that sense of place through her painting. Oh.
Well, I looked at this before and I went to know. Thanks for letting us look more closely.
So let's shift to that wall. I'm just going to touch briefly on this painting here. This is by Manfred or Fred Kajip or Kajip. I've actually never, I should find out how he pronounced his own last name. But the reason I want to look at this is that he was part of a small group of Edmonton Art Club members that were polio patients and became painters after they learned to handle the brush with their mouths. So Fred contracted polio in 1960 and spent really long periods of time at the U of A hospital, where he met two other artists who were also club members. And he was mentored by them, as well as by J.B. Taylor, who was an important professor at the U of A. And he learned to paint, and he went on to have a really prolific career. And he mostly did landscapes as well, and again, kind of specialized in winter scenes, like Cartmell before him, who we saw. So I just mentioned J.B. Taylor, who was one of Kajip's mentors, and we'll look at a painting by J.B. Taylor right here. So in addition to artists teaching in the Edmonton Public School Board and the primary system, several of them also taught in post-secondary. And J.B. Taylor is really a key figure to the professionalization of artists in this province. So for a bit of background, prior to the establishment of the Department of Fine Art in 46, 47, you could only take art classes in the city through the Faculty of Extension. So you couldn't get a BFA, but you could take courses through Extension. And Extension actually was, they helped to start the Banff School of Fine Art, which we now know as the Banff Center, in 1934. So there were art education opportunities, but you couldn't do like a full, degree program until the late 40s. So J.B. Taylor was born in Charlottetown, and he studied in New York. And during the Second World War, he worked as an artist for the war. And he had an interesting job. He painted illusionistic landscapes for the purpose of recognition. So he would paint enemy planes so that the military could practice recognizing them. And then he would also paint the base canteens. He would paint murals on their walls. And following the war, he was to Edmonton to teach in the newly established Department of Fine Art. And a key part of his education responsibilities were also bringing art elsewhere in the province. So he spent a lot of time traveling throughout rural Alberta and the Northwest Territories to teach in those places, and also in mental health facilities and to incarcerated people. So, he was really focused on trying to bring art elsewhere to people where they might not have such readily access an art education. Before I tell you a little bit about this painting, I'm curious if there's what you think it might be or what you see in it. I've heard people say all sorts of things when they look at this painting. Yeah. So someone wall, and yeah. Does anyone see anything different? Well, you are right. He was definitely inspired by ice and mountains. So he spent several summers teaching at the Banff School, and he was particularly interested in the rock surface and glacial ice. So he started his career working in kind of these romantic landscape images, and then during the war, obviously this really highly realistic scene. But near the end of his career, he really started experimenting with abstraction. So he started using newly available acrylic paints and tools other than paint brushes to really work at the surface, create texture. You can see things like drips happening. And then rather than the Mount Robson, for example, where it has this view of the mountains, we have this really kind of close view of rocks or ice and the surface tension that might happen with it melting and freezing. So we're going to look at the wall right behind us. So this showcases work from the Alberta Society of Artists, but these were all Edmonton Art Club members. So the ASA formed in 1931, and several art club members were original members of the society. And this was really important to connecting Edmonton and Calgary and to artists across the province. And one really fantastic thing the ASA did for a number of years was publish a magazine called Highlights. And, you know, if we think about, this is a really kind of time in Alberta where there's intense growth in the arts, the magazine was an important form of communication. So people would publish essays in it. Oftentimes they would write letters back and forth around the same topic over several editions, you know, debating something about the arts. And for a period of time, they included original prints in the magazine. So this was a pretty novel idea for the time. So sometimes they were covers like this one or like the third one. And then they also included several prints in the magazine. And these were made at the artist's own expense. So on one hand, it was a really generous thing, but it also allowed several of these artists to work kind of really experimentally. You know, they're on a smaller scale in a reproducible medium. And so it allowed them, kind of like Ruth Haley, for example, to do things that they might not otherwise do on a larger scale in an oil painting. But also I think this is really important because it shows us a keen interest in printmaking in Alberta, which we know has continued. I mean, the U of A has a really important print program, and SNAP, the print studio. So we have this really robust history of printmaking in the province. And I think a lot of that kind of starts with these prints included in Highlights magazine. Okay, so we'll go around the corner. So these two rooms continue the kind of landscape and nature theme, but we have rural landscapes over there. And then over here we have floral and mushroom or fungi imagery. So this is an artist whose name was Lenny Shalkwick Berenson. And she was born in the Netherlands and received a master's degree there in horticulture. And then when she came to Edmonton, she had an amateur interest in mushrooms. So she would go out looking for them, but didn't really have the ability to identify them. So she would pick specimens, write really detailed notes, and send them to Ottawa to be identified at a lab there. But then she also produced these amazing paintings. And you know, clearly photographic technology would have been available to her. These were made in the early 70s, but she really wasn't interested in photographing the mushrooms. And I think this was because, you know, painting them necessitated that she really spent more time with them, got up close, paid attention to their details and colors and layers. And then she translated these paintings into watercolors that illustrated her book, Mushrooms of Western Canada. And that was published in 1991. And for any mushroom enthusiasts out there, this really remains one of the definitive sources about mushrooms of the Northwest region of North America. You might remember her because she only passed away in 2010. She was often featured in the Edmonton Journal and was always called the Mushroom Lady. And there were often recipes of hers for different mushroom dishes. And she was a really long time member of the club and served as its president for a few years. And as far as I've seen, she only painted mushrooms. I've never seen anything else. So this is a plate. It then became, you know, a smaller image that was included in the book. So this is a watercolor, and you might be as surprised as I was to learn that this is also a watercolor. So this is by an artist named Vivian Tierfelder. And after she obtained her BFA at the U of A, she actually began her career working for the Provincial Museum, now the RAM, on diorama design and production. So that leads me to believe that she's always had a really kind of keen attention to detail, to texture. And then eventually she started, you know, working full-time as an artist, and she pretty much exclusively works in watercolor. And some of her images are these intimate views of leaves or blades of grass or a little pile of stones. And others are these really impressive and elaborate still life compositions. So you can see how she combines flowers and objects and fabrics to build up these kind of complex compositions. And oftentimes they also include tropical flowers inspired by extended periods of time she spent in Hawaii. And so, you know, the still life genre we often know and associate with kind of 17th century Dutch painting, and often was, you know, a display of the material pleasures of life, which I think we're seeing something similar here, or a commentary on the kind of brevity or fleetingness of life. But then later, at the turn of the 20th century, we see modern artists using still life as a kind of neutral basis for more formal experiments. So if you think about the Cubists, for example, taking a still life composition and chopping it up into planes of shape and color. So we can see here, this painting is from 1988. So still life continues to influence, you know, be a genre that a lot of artists are interested in working in and can carry so many different meanings. So I like showcasing this one because it's just quite impressive. So we'll go to that back wall and kind of our last section of the show. Oh, actually, I meant to talk about this work here. Do you mind flipping around? Okay, sorry. So I'm going to talk about these really small works. So you'll have to come through and kind of get close to them after I'm done talking. These are some of my favorite works in the show, actually. So these are by Thelma Menari, and she was born in Edmonton and started studying art really young with Florence Mortimer, whose work we looked at earlier. And throughout her career, she's experimented with a lot of styles. So we actually have a really kind of Cubist influenced portrait painting in the back room that you'll see. Worked in abstraction, but at some point she almost entirely worked to working on these small etchings. So these are little prints. And she very much admired the Alberta landscape, as several of the artists we've talked about, and was interested in human and man-made icons. So something like grain elevators often show up in her work. And so these are views that she would have seen in Alberta traveling in her car, seen through a window. And you really get that sense when you can kind of get up close and look at them. But one reason I quite like this work is that there are all these threads in the exhibition, connections from one artist to another in these networks. And I've tried to tease those out by visual connections or through the labels. And one that isn't obvious by just looking at this piece is that she acquired her printing press from another art club member named Carolyn Kaufman, who's also in this show. And Carolyn Kaufman inherited it from an artist named George Brown. And so it got passed down through the generations. And if any of you recall, there was a plaque at the very beginning of the show that was by George Brown. He was a metal worker, but also a printmaker, and was known for some really innovative etching techniques. So that was kind of the beginning of what I was talking about with this printmaking community in Edmonton. So that's this nice kind of display of artists sharing their materials and their knowledge from one to another. We also have but those two paintings at the end of the wall by Rosemary Rees and Kay May, they're of the same scene or the same place. Entirely know this to be true, but it leads me to think that they were likely sketching together, which was very common. Still, a lot of Edmonton art clubs do that together, go somewhere and have a day sketching and then produce their work from that. So that's another kind of one of those connections. So it was nice when I found both those paintings. Okay, so now we'll go to this back wall. So this is the last thematic section of the show. So here I've included works showcasing urban scenes, a lot of Edmonton scenes, or the figure or portraiture. And some of the artists obviously are doing those things together, like Llewellyn Petley Jones. I believe this is a view of the River Thames. So I've talked a lot about kind of a network in Edmonton, but several of these artists were also traveling abroad and bringing those ideas back into their practice and back into Edmonton. So Llewellyn Petley Jones was born in Edmonton, had an interest in art from a very young age, he started a brief career in banking. I think that only lasted about 3 years. And then he gave that up and dedicated his life to being an artist. But he spent a lot of time learning and having a studio throughout Europe. So in England, in Paris, in Italy. And he was influenced and learning from a lot of modern art trends happening there. So I think we see kind of remnants of things like Fauvism. This painting is much later, but has that really kind of expressive color. And yeah, this quite lively scene here. Okay, so we'll move to the back wall of this space. So I wanted to look at these two paintings here by Thelma Walker. She was a pretty fascinating figure and really important to Edmonton's culture and heritage. So she was born in the US and studied art and music in Chicago. She actually started her career in music. So when she settled in Edmonton, she was first performing and teaching music. She was also really interested in history. So she wrote a lot of articles about the history of Edmonton. Eventually, she published a book called Fortress North, which kind of traced the history of the city from Fort Edmonton to around the time of the establishment of the city airport. In 1930, or in the 30s, she met Arthur Lismer, who was a member of the Group of Seven, and she ended up turning her art. So she did illustrations for her book and then also made paintings. And she was really fascinated and inspired by the Mexican muralists and people like Diego Rivera and how they painted history and the present day and had this, socially infused art. And so these paintings are not historical scenes. They're painting industry. They're really forward-looking industry that's happening at the time. So we see the city airport, which many of you will know, and the oil refinery. And what I like about these, kind of compared to some of these earlier watercolors we looked at, is these are much less romantic and a lot grittier and really capturing that kind of industrial scene. But she also experimented and she took some workshops at Emma Lake, which is sort of this modernist hub in Saskatchewan. And she ended up experimenting a lot with abstraction as well. So back in that rural section, if you're walking back through, there's a painting of hers of a plowed field, but it's really quite minimal and pared down. And this sort of lovely abstracted scene of rural life. She was also important to her for her work with the Archives and Landmark Committee, which is what the Edmonton Archives has become. So she worked really hard to preserve local landmarks in the city, and including heritage trees, which was a pretty novel idea at the time to kind of preserve trees in the city. And the city of Edmonton has a really great online exhibition about Thelma Walker if you're interested in learning more. And they have more images of her work, but also historic photographs and that. So we just have 2 more stops because I know I've taken up quite a bit of your time. I wanted to look at these scenes of Edmonton, which are many years later by George Weber, a printmaker. So these were done about 40 years later than these. And you can see the city is more developed. They're mostly downtown views of the river. We have several of these. I think these are about four of, I think, 15 we have in the collection. And George Weber was born in Germany, but in the 1920s, he was really sensing a dangerous political climate, so he came to Canada. And he first settled in Toronto, and he worked in commercial wallpaper design. So he was making wallpaper, and he was also studying at the Ontario College of Art, learning more about silkscreen techniques, which was fairly new. And then he came to Edmonton, and he's really credited with bringing silkscreen kind of technology to the area. And he taught a lot of people silk screening, and he also was importing papers from Europe and from Japan for the benefit of printmakers in this city. So kind of another print connection there. And then our last stop to sort of bring us back to the AGA is just on this wall. So recognize this person. It is not Emily Carr, no. No, good guess. So there's another bronze bust of the same woman on the promenade above Victoria Golf Course. No, not group of five. So this woman is named Maud Bowman. And Maud Bowman was the very first president and director of the AGA, or what was then the Edmonton Museum of Arts. So she came here from England, and she was part of something called the Women's Art Association of Canada. So they had local chapters across the country, and that really gave her access to kind of an artistic group of like-minded people, and to something called the Local Council of Women. And so she solicited the support of the Edmonton Art Club and political and financial leaders in the city to establish the very first art gallery here and the very first permanent collection. The bust is made by an art club member named Frank Norbury. He was from England as well, and he had a really booming business in Liverpool making sculptures or carvings for buildings. But then he enlisted in the war, and when he came back, his business was completely overrun, and he realized it'd be so expensive to reestablish himself, so he moved to Canada, and he became quite well known here for his war memorials. So he has one in Red Deer and one in Lacombe, and this painting by Llewellyn Petley Jones, the same artist on the opposite side of the wall, is a portrait of Norbury, the sculptor of the bust. So these are two works from the collection, and they have this really nice visual connection that we don't get to kind of display often together. I've looked at a lot of historic photographs of Norbury, and this seems to capture him exactly. I mean, he's never smiling in them and always kind of has these bushy furrowed eyebrows, and is doing one of his war memorial pieces. So this is a nice kind of connection back to the gallery. And again, the importance of women in the history of the arts here in Edmonton and at Alberta. So that brings me to the end. I think I talked for a long time, and I missed a lot of artwork. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in person or from the crew online.
Yeah. So yeah, we're in the Q&A section. So you'll notice that there's people online. So if you have a question in the audience here, or if you have a question online, you can put in the chat. But if you're in the audience here, me or Danielle will probably repeat your question so it gets in the mic so people online can hear it. So any questions from the audience? Someone said online, thank you, great tour.
Thank you. That is the painting I mentioned when we were looking at those tiny etchings. So, you know, think about how those were like this big, and now we have this other representation. So we have a few examples of artists working in totally different styles within this exhibition. Yeah.
I guess I have a question. What was your approach to deciding the artwork? Was it mostly the thematic tying everything together, or was some artwork that you're like, oh, I have to include this?
That was a challenge because we had about 500 members and I looked them all up. Part of it is availability, you know, so what could I find in collections? So that was a big part. I really wanted to have as kind of many of the charter members as I could. The Edmonton Art Gallery, so prior to the AGA, did a 65 anniversary show of the club. So there are some repeats from that show, but I really wanted to also bring this up in time. And so it was important to me that we had some artists who were working in the 90s and 2000s. And then, so partially availability, and anyone who, I really kind of picked artists often who had kind of this broader story, this contributions to the arts in other ways, and then shaped it through these themes. So there were some works that I think could have been interesting in the show, but were sort of outliers in terms of fitting into some of the main ideas I saw. So really that was the figure, the city, and the landscape were kind of the things that kept popping up over that 100 years. And it's hard to obviously bring together a show of such a long history.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I have a kind of a comment from the chat. Is asking you to speak a little bit more about the portrait artists with the club, since we've seen a lot of landscapes.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So this artist is quite interesting. So this is Dorothy Hensel Willis, and we actually have two of her works. So this one, and then that blue painting over there. And she was really well known in Edmonton at the time she was working. And she's kind of a fascinating character because she really embodied, or at least the media portrayed her as this really bohemian artist type. And she also studied and traveled widely through Europe. And she had a pretty, I think, unique approach to painting for the Edmonton scene at the time. And so she was often painting her dreams, fears, subconscious. The U of A has a really lovely collection of her work, as well as the AFA. So there's a lot of kind of more surrealist influenced work. And she often incorporated strong colors, bold shapes, and would experiment with her painting application. So in this case, other than the outlines, the rest of the painting is actually finger painting. So she was doing kind of interesting things like that. And then she moved to Vancouver eventually near the end of the 40s and taught at UBC. And she was really interested in art therapy. And from what I understand of the history of art therapy, this would have been sort of the beginnings of it becoming more formalized in Europe and the US. So she was kind of forward thinking in that way. We also have this grouping of portraits over here. So this is, I think, the only self-portrait we have in the show. This is by an artist named Dr. Egerton Pope. So he was a doctor at the U of A, and then was a member of the art club, and is really depicting himself as more of an academic and a doctor rather than his sort of artistic self. This painting here is by someone named Esther Scar Freeman. And it is a portrait of another art club member named Murray McDonald. And we didn't look at Murray McDonald's work, but he is in this show twice. And he was, for several years, the head of art for Edmonton Public Schools, for Edmonton Public School Board. And so he taught a lot of artists. And she actually studied with him. She went to Queen Alex School in grade 9 and had him as a teacher. So this is years later, kind of her homage to him. And we have a few examples of artists painting other artists in this show. And then this painting here is by Ilda Lubain. And she was another teacher. She taught at the Banff School, but she was born in Latvia and immigrated here. And so here's an example of where I think we're seeing some of people's influence from elsewhere when they're coming. So working in this kind of icon, which is, unlike anything else in this show.
Does anyone have a question from the audience? No? Okay, well, I see another question from the chat. So the chat is taking over. As Abigail asks, how can we learn more about the club's members? So how can we learn more about the members?
Well, there's a few ways. As I mentioned, we did a show of theirs for the 65th anniversary, and there was a really great catalog produced, and that's there's an essay in it by the art historian Joan Greer, and that really has a great history of the club up until that point. And I think the club might even have a scan of it on their website.
Yes, we've got it's available on the as a document on the website.
Perfect. And then if you want to learn more about their current members, you can go to their website or you can come see the show. And they also produced a commemorative publication for this 100 years. So each one of their members is showcased in there, I think with a 1 or 2 page spread showing their artwork, their bio, and then there's interspersed some history in that book as well. And where can people get that?
That's available on the website.
On the website.
How many members are right now? 44.
Yeah. So I think 40 is pretty average yearly. Yeah.
Between 40 and 50. So,
Yeah.
it depends on how active people are in their art. We worried that we would lose some through COVID, but in fact, we gained some through COVID.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Certainly increased with the awareness created by the shows
Yeah.
here.
So for those online who might not have heard, there's 44 members currently,
Correct.
and they've actually had a boost in membership since COVID. So, yeah.
Well, that's fabulous. I see that there's no more further questions. We have time for one more question. Does anyone have anything that they want to ask? No, well, maybe we'll just cut it then. So
Thank you
people
so
have a
much for
chance to
coming.
see the exhibition downstairs. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thanks to everyone watching online. That's it for us. Thanks again.